Our teachers, this is an introduction to critical literacy. So a little bit of pre-reading, background information, and knowledge here to enable you to better comprehend the article, the two articles that we're going to read on critical literacy, which are a little bit dense, sort of packed with theory and also practical implications for the classroom. So, what is critical literacy? First of all, before we get into the actual definition, we need this basic building block, right? So, critical literacy works on the idea that no text is neutral. All texts are ideological and sort of loaded with the ideology of the person who produced or the group who produced the text. So, a commercial is ideological. As is a novel, right? Everything sort of reflects the ideology, whether it was intentionally embedded within the text, as would a political speech, or whether it was unintentionally embedded within the text, as might a novel that's not trying to be ideological, but we still see represented the ideologies of the person who created that text. So if no text is neutral and all texts are ideological, we want to make sure we have a good understanding of what ideology means, what it means for something to be ideological. So I have several definitions here. And actually, the simplest definition is the last one. An ideology is a set of opinions or beliefs of a group or individual. To get a little more complex than that, not only is it the set of beliefs, but they guide us. So they're sort of the perspectives that define and guide us. This definition offers to us that it's our social and political philosophies or systems of ideas. So it's not just a single idea, it's sort of a system of ideas that explain the world and change it, and therefore guide us. So you can think of it as sort of the perspectives that are tied to politics or that are tied to, our social constructs in the world. I like this one, cultural beliefs that justify particular social arrangements, including patterns of inequality. So this one specifically mentions cultural beliefs. So groups of people, cultures, even a political group can be thought of as cultural or expressing cultural beliefs that justify the way our society is arranged. So there are ideologies between the way our school systems are set up. There are ideologies in the way that sports operate, and they justify the way things are. Progressive social movements also have ideologies that are attempting to change the world. And this one specifically mentions two patterns of inequality. So when we think about things like oppression, social injustice, we're thinking about the ideologies that set the world up in that unequal way. For example, this American belief in work ethic, or that we can pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. That's an ideology shared by a group, right? A cultural group of people, and the individuals within, right? So we see that reflected in commercials that show imagery of people achieving despite where they came from. Or we see that in movies and pop culture. We see that in songs, right? So all of these texts they mirror back to us our ideologies. So no text is neutral, all texts are ideological. And critical literacy rests on the idea that the texts our students consume are ideological texts. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want students to sort of just accept the ideologies within the text that they see, whether it's media, whether it's novels, or billboards, right? Whatever it happens to be. So here's a quote from the first essay that we will read, Canonical Literature and Critical Literacy. Familiar approaches to literature instruction typically leave these dominant ideologies unexamined and unquestioned. So if it's a dominant ideology, Many people say the dominant ideologies of America create systems of inequality, okay? So the criticism offered by the authors here is that familiar approaches to literature instruction, the way we tend to teach literature or often teach literature, leaves these problematic ideologies unexamined and unquestioned. We're not teaching students to interrogate the texts, thereby potentially perpetuating ideologies that privilege some and marginalize others. Can you see even in this, there are ideologies represented, right? We can see the ideologies of the authors coming through here. Critical literacy, by contrast, aims to draw attention to implicit ideologies and textual practices by examining issues of power, normativity, and representation. So critical literacy says students need to be paying attention to these ideologies and then say, these ideologies are sometimes not okay. And these ideologies also reflect inequalities in our real society, and we should be doing something about that to make a more equitable society. Okay, so critical literacy here, this is a definition from the International Literacy Association. Critical literacy is the ability to actively read texts in a manner that promotes a deeper understanding of those socially constructed concepts like power, inequality, and injustice in human relationships or human institutions. When you hear critical literacy, I want you to think these three words: ideology, society, and power. So critical literacy is a little bit woke. It's a little bit about being woke, seeing the inequities within our society and teaching students to see and question those inequities as well. Here is a Frayer model, our 4-square vocabulary definition thing. So we've got the definition in the top left, characteristics on the right. I've added a few: ideology, power, injustice, inequity, and society. So those are sort of just key words I want you to associate with critical literacy. This is what it might look like. So if you are noticing and interrogating any type of stereotype you see in any type of text, really. So for example, stereotypical portrayals of people with disabilities in popular culture. I notice in a lot of TV shows, people with autism are portrayed in this way. And then saying, oh, that's a little bit problematic. Like, do we really want that to be this one-sided stereotypical portrayal? And how does that impact actual people with autism or actual people with disabilities? So relating that portrayal that we see in the text to the treatment of people with disabilities in our real world. Now, a lot of students, when they hear critical literacy, they think critical thinking, and we get the assumption that those two terms are synonymous. They're not the same thing. You do need critical thinking skills in order to do critical literacy, but critical literacy is really, it's a different concept because it has that interrogation of social constructs and the way things are represented within text, those ideologies we see in text. Critical thinking can be a lot of other things as well. So critical thinking can be just sort of analysis, thinking about how parts are related to each other. That's not critical literacy. So they are not the same concept, although you do need critical thinking skills to do critical literacy. Here are some helpful images or graphics I've found that might help you begin to have a better understanding of critical literacy. So please come back to these and examine them on your own so that you can build some of these key understandings into your understanding of critical literacy. I really like this one down here. Teachers encourage students to interrogate societal issues like poverty, access, equity, equality, to critique the structures that serve as norms. So, for example, in our society, one ideology that's fairly dominant is that, well, some people are just going to be poor, and it's probably because they haven't been working hard enough. And so we almost see it as the norm. Well, that's just the way that things are. But critical literacy would teach students to interrogate those norms. Things like gender norms as well. If you are teaching students to interrogate gender norms and ask, well, what we as a society consider normal, like, is that a thing, right? Is that acceptable to us? Is that problematic, or is that fine? Challenging the power relations within the messages we get from texts. Here's a really helpful one too, critical literacy pedagogy. So if you're teaching for critical literacy, here is what that might look like within the classroom. So please do come back to this or pause here and take a second to think through this, this portrayal of critical literacy. So again, from that same text that we're going to read, canonical literature for critical literacy. A critical literacy approach to canonical literature interrupts dominant ideologies that are so often taken for granted, promoting inquiry rooted in questions like what and whose stories do and don't these canonized texts tell. So what voices are left out? What voices are represented? What assumptions do these texts and the literature itself that we're teaching to the students make? What assumptions do they make about dominant cultural values and ideologies? And then I really like this last sentence. Questions like these can provide the basis upon which canonical texts can be used to interrogate broader cultural assumptions, issues, and practices. So we don't just stop at interrogating the ideology of the book we're reading or the commercial we're analyzing in class. We then turn that lens toward interrogating like the way our society is set up. So you see there's a little bit of wokeness, a little bit of like advocacy. Sometimes teachers do sort of like choose an issue that you feel that is really important to you and like create a protest sign or something, right? So there's a little bit of that advocacy for issues of inequity within our society that can be related to this. So here was the beginning slide I showed, and I'm really curious if anybody saw this and thought, why do we not have any brown or black hands in this image, right? And if you thought that, that's critical literacy, because you are looking at this image, and an image is a text, and you were interrogating it, and by doing that, sort of relating that interrogation to a broader discussion about representation in our society, right? Critical literacy is often about underrepresented people, and yet in this image that I found online, we have those same problems represented in this image. So I definitely chose it ironically just to sort of see or give you an example of what it would be like to do critical literacy on this type of image. And remember, anything is a text. You can read in air quotes, anything as a text, and therefore you can interrogate any type of text. So I hope this was helpful to you in developing your understanding of critical literacy, and that hopefully too will help you read the text with a better understanding. So that first text is going to talk about the definition of critical literacy and what the authors argue are the benefits of critical literacy. And those are the key things I want you to pay attention to. And we will for sure have a really good discussion about critical literacy in class. See you then.